Welcome everybody to this afternoon's ad hoc session, I think we can call it, just me being in town and Jolie having been able to arrange this quick gathering to discuss anything to do with IANA stewardship transition, ICANN accountability, any other questions which you might have on the aspects of, the aspects of ICANN, any processes that are currently taking place. My name is Olivier Crépin-Leblond. I'm the chair of the English chapter of the Internet Society. My claim to fame is that I was also the chair of the At-Large Advisory Committee for 4 years and still involved in At-Large. I'm now the chair of the European At-Large Organization, which is the equivalent to the North American Regional At-Large Organization, which ISOC New York is a part of. So today I've brought a number of presentations here for you, and it's pretty much down to what you're interested in, whether you'd like to be to start perhaps with the overall process that was used for building together these proposals, or whether you want to dig straight into the IANA stewardship transition proposal that was prepared by the community, or whether you're more interested in ICANN accountability proposal, which has just started to be open for public comment a few days ago on the 1st of November, and on the no, it's the 1st of December already. Goodness, it goes so fast. 1st of December, I'm 1 month off, and that will remain open for 21 days. So it's a very short amount of time for commenting, and of course ISOC New York is very welcome to comment either directly in the proposal, in the public comment system, or to go via At-Large and contribute to the At-Large feedback that will be given in time. What are you most interested in?
Why don't you
and David?
start way at the top and tell us exactly what ICANN is and why it's important. And
Okay.
in very, very few words, explain how ICANN came to be the sole, practically speaking, the sole controller of domain names and IP addresses on the internet. If you may recall, back in the early days of the internet, there were multiple routes, so that there were actually different domain name systems, as it were. And one, I guess, through a process of, some would say evolution, and others more critical people would say some other negative things, but ICANN came to be the sole controller.
Sole controller, okay. I don't like to use the word controller. I think the sole coordinator perhaps would be the right thing. So my involvement with the internet is since 1988. I first used it right after or right before the RTM worm, the Rupert Tappan-Morris worm that pulled the internet down. And so I have seen most of the processes by which the whole ICANN was created, etc. I was actually part of the Internet Ad Hoc Committee that had prepared a rival project that was going to take over the running of the route. Originally, the actual system was not running using a domain name system. There was actually a table. Okay. Does it work? Yeah. There was.
It doesn't work. Yes.
Okay. So before the DNS, there was actually a table which was manually updated, and you would basically have to add all of the hosts that were getting connected. It was great when there were only a handful of people using the internet, a handful of organizations. But as time went on, it became such a full-time job to add the websites and so on. The DNS was created to be able to go around that. The original route was run by the US Department of Defense. And as more and more commercial organizations, the largest growth was actually first in universities, but then immediately afterwards it was the commercial world. There were some concerns emitted by taxpayers, US taxpayers. Why is the Department of Defense used to update this DNS and to run this DNS worldwide? And there were several proposals which were made for an organization to take over running the DNS. Now you mentioned several routes. Yes, there was a time when there were alternate routes that were being pushed. The debate has always been there of whether there should be a single route or there should be more than one route. I know that partisans of the open route system are saying, well, we don't need to have a single route. We could have a peer route with different organizations running it. But for reasons which are probably those of, I guess, the U.S. government, was that they had the sole control over what was going to take over from the U.S. Department of Defense, and they decided that ICANN was going to be a new organization that we're going to create that was going to be primarily people on the board, all selected directly by the world's population, end users at large. And so they created ICANN in the late 90s and had a temporary board for the first couple of years, and then the first set of elections that took place to have board members replaced with new people that were selected by the internet community. That experiment didn't go down too well because the sole defining factor for being able to vote was to actually have an email address and a postal address. The postal address they never really checked, actually, in some way. The email address was the defining thing, but Gmail already existed at the time. Hotmail existed at the time as well. And no, Gmail did not exist. Sorry, no, but Hotmail existed at the time, and there were also other. Yahoo existed at the time, and so it was very easy to create new email addresses and to effectively not vote once, but vote 100 times, 200 times, and whatever. And sure enough, this system was used by the Chaos Computer Club in Germany on the one hand. I believe it was Fujitsu, the Japanese company, that felt that, we should have someone from Fujitsu on the board of directors. Had no idea what ICANN was, but hey, it sounds like a good thing to be on. So they got all their employees to vote for that person as well. And we ended up with a board of various people that most of which didn't have a clue about what was asked of them, some of whom knew what they were going to do or what they wanted. It was seen that the election process was just not working correctly. So in 2003, they decided to change the way the board is selected. At large was somehow kicked out of the equation and put there as an advisory committee, and the generic name supporting organization was created out of the domain name supporting organization. Country code name supporting organization was also brought in there, and so they ended up with a board that was selected primarily by the name supporting organizations, but also a nominating committee that would be somehow independent and be able to, that nominating committee being composed of members of the ICANN community, being able to select at least half of the board and put it on there. And from that point onwards, ICANN has evolved in a, I would say, pretty stable way. There was a lot of discussion for many years about the creation of new generic top-level domains. The .com, .net, .org was getting very crowded, especially .com was a space that was extremely crowded. Domain speculators being on there, as you know, there's more demand than supply. Some people will purchase and think they can sell at a premium later, and certainly some people made an absolute fortune doing this. And in the meantime, the alternate routes were not, didn't get, I guess, the support that they could have received, because primarily I think and that's a personal view, majority of people out there are interested in having an internet that works. They're not interested in the politics of who is really behind it, except of course if things don't work. At that point they start looking at things and want someone else to take care of it. Primary mission of ICANN is to coordinate the system, the internet's identifiers. It does the ICANN community does the policy for the domain names part of things. There are two other component parts. There's the IP addresses. Every computer on the internet has got an IP address, and these are coordinated by the address support organization. And the policy for addresses is actually done at another level through regional internet registries that are distribution channel throughout the world for providing IP addresses. And each regional internet registry is able to build its own policies. So you'll have slightly different allocation policies depending on what part of the world you're based in. There is no such thing as country internet resources, sort of providing IP addresses on a per country basis, because the internet is borderless. It's one of these things where if you try and put borders, then it's likely to be very inefficient and to not work well. And so far, there doesn't appear to have been any major problem until we've now reached the IPv4, the current format of addressing, running out of addresses. The people that designed the internet never imagined that there were going to be, I think it's 3.6 billion internet users today. Every time I say the number, there's 100,000 or a few 100,000 more, so it might be 3.7 billion, I don't know. But it's a lot of people, and through the use of some technical ways, such as network address translation, they've managed to fit more people on the net, but we're now reaching breaking point, and there needs to be a shift to a new, longer style of address called IP version 6. Version 5 went nowhere, so we went from 4 to 6, and that's one of the major pieces of work that the regional internet registries are doing, especially when it comes down to how they're going to allocate this. On the country code side of things, so .us, .de for Germany, .uk for United Kingdom, the policy takes place at national level. So ICANN has virtually nothing, no say whatsoever in what the national policy is for a country code top-level domain. And I think it's one of these things where they're not likely to ever have anything to say about them due to the sovereignty issues that most country code operators immediately raise as soon as ICANN tries to tell them to do one thing or another. The financing of ICANN comes from, I come from at large, so we see this as a tax that goes on every domain name that is sold out there. Sometimes it's $1 or a little bit more on every domain name that gets sold. It gets paid back over to ICANN, and so that's where it derives its income from. As far as the country code top-level domains are concerned, some country code registries decide that they want to give ICANN money, and it's an entirely open thing because many of the country code operators predate ICANN, so they would see ICANN as being this evil organization that suddenly comes in and says, we want to grab your money. So and of course, they predate ICANN, so it's their right to operate any way they want. Not all country code operators are part of the country code name supporting organization. Some of them are totally outside that remit. And others, some are within the country code name supporting organization but don't pay any fees whatsoever. Others make yearly donations, and some make very hefty, very large donations to continue supporting ICANN. Why ICANN and no other organization? Well, I think I mentioned that earlier. The stability has been very good so far. There hasn't been any collapse of the internet due to the domain name system. The root servers are not part of ICANN, but they receive their information from the main route that ICANN feeds, if you want, in somewhere, or coordinates with a contractor called VeriSign. They're the one that have been so far been contracted to do this. And the ICANN does this through a small part of the organization called the Internet Address Numbers, Assigned Numbers, Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, IANA, which is the IANA that you see on the screen here. It's a purely technical role, and the US government has been involved with the whole process of adding or removing domains from the root, from the top-level domain list, as just a steward to make sure that everything runs well, and that policy that ICANN or the other organizations have developed is actually adhered to when a reallocation of the domain name, of the top-level domain is being undertaken. I know it's a lot of information all at once, but I hope that it kind of shows you all the different things. The alternate routes have pretty much, I would say, died down in a way, or at least you can't really see them much anymore.
We have a good representative here in New York, Paul Garren, who is a champion of the alternate route and has sued ICANN on more than one occasion, not one.
But this somehow fallen by the wayside, and my view on what is the worth of ICANN, well, for me, it was an experiment to start with, because this whole top-level domain space could have been run by the International Telecommunications Union. Governments could have run those system identifiers And no one knows whether they would have done a good job or a bad job, but that would have meant that the end users and businesses would have had much less of a say in the future of the domain name system than the current system, where you have a multi-stakeholder input, thanks to the way that ICANN is structured.
Just getting back onto that, I mean, I've seen criticisms of ICANN that it's basically been captured by the industry. Could you talk about the GNSO and the difference between the contracted and non-contracted and how those things balance out?
Yeah, I wish I had known. I would have put the thing on the GNSO on here. So effectively, the generic name supporting organization is what they call a bicameral committee. So you've got the whole GNSO with the different stakeholder groups. And half of the stakeholder groups are contracted parties, and half of them are non-contracted parties. So the contracted parties include the registries. These are the organizations that run .com, .net, .org, as an example. And then they're not customer facing. They don't actually sell domain names directly to the end customer, to you and I. They actually then sell through, well, they're not resellers, but through registrars. And the registrars are the companies like GoDaddy, for example, who basically sell the domain names and then insert it over, pass it on over to the registry for them to be added over to the root. I mean, this is the way that they sell the domain name system, the domain names in the ladder, if you want. So half of the GNSO Council, which is this council of representatives of all of the different parties, and this is the council that basically gives the green light on any new policy that is being implemented in the GNSO working groups. Half of this council is made up of contracted parties. The other half is made up of non-contracted parties. And in that, you have the intellectual property constituency, you have the business constituency, you have the ISP, Internet Service Provider constituency. And these three constituencies are part of the commercial stakeholder group within the non-contracted parties. And then in the non-commercial stakeholder group, you have the NCUC, the non-commercial users constituency, and you have the not-for-profit organization constituency. So immediately what you see there is that the non-contracted party side is very much chopped up with many different organizations that sometimes don't agree with each other. The intellectual property constituency might have entirely different points of view than the non-commercial users constituency. And this is where the non-contracted parties house is less homogeneous and less likely to vote together as the contracted parties house, who at the end of the day are all part of the same business. Now, this of course is not always the case, because the contracted parties house, you have to remember, are many different companies that are competitors with each other. But in general, when it comes down to policy, and policy doesn't go down to policy relating to a single company, we're talking about policy that applies to everyone. In general, they work together, and so they are able to actually have a large chunk of votes, whether they're in favor or against a policy that is being proposed. On the other side, what the contracted parties really need is to just have one or two allies on the other side that might be okay with them, and the policy that they are supporting will move forward. And that's why one often says that the GNSO is somehow slanted towards the contracted parties, because they have the ability to push policy through much more easily than the non-contracted parties house is concerned.
So the at large is outside this whole process and is advisory to the board. So once the GNSO approves some policy, that goes to the board. How does at large affect how that policy goes or doesn't go?
Okay, so you've got the supporting organizations, as I said, so the country code name supporting organization and the generic name supporting organization that we've just been talking about. The GNSO makes the policy. The way that policy is made is through working groups. It has a working group on every single topic that needs to be addressed. And they do what's called a PDP, a policy development process, which is a well-oiled system with first staff comes up with a list of issues, and then the working group feeds back into this, the working group is created, and then the working group comes up with a set of recommendations which then go through the GNSO Council for voting. The GNSO working groups are open for everyone to take part in. And so At Large is one of ICANN's advisory committees. There are a number of them. The two main ones, I would say, or the three real main ones that do a lot of things. The SSAC, the Security and Stability Advisory Committee, advises on ICANN's anything to do with security and stability with regards to domain names. And they've done a damn good job because, as I told you earlier, there's never been any collapse of the whole system. The Government Advisory Committee is the input vehicle for the governments of the world to be able to bring their advice to the ICANN board. And in general, it's very difficult for governments to take part in working groups because no single government representative has the ability to represent the other governments. They can only represent either themselves as an individual or represent their own government. And if you've dealt with governments, you'll find out that the person standing in front of you, you ask them questions. If the answer is not on their sheet, they're not able to answer you, and they say, I'll have to get back to that, on you about that. The problem being, of course, that sometimes it takes weeks for him to come back, and by then a working group has moved on. The At-Large Advisory Committee brings the input of the Internet end users through its structures of regional at-large organizations and the at-large structures who are supposed to help bring the feedback on any of the ICANN policies. The At-Large Advisory Committee is able to comment on everything ICANN related. There's no limit as to what it can comment on, which is a great thing. But as I said, it's an advisory committee, so it will advise the board, it will advise the GNSO Council, it will provide advice, but nobody is bound by that advice. On the other hand, the At-Large Advisory Committee can also send people to these GNSO working groups. So we work at an earlier level, rather than waiting for the policy to be, all ready and I's dotted and T's crossed, and then sent to the council, and the council saying that's what we're going to do. We can actually send people into the working groups and influence on the policy at a much earlier stage. And it's a lot of work because these GNSO working groups have a very short amount of time sometimes to come up with policies. And it's also sometimes hard, challenging to be in there because what you have in those working groups are lawyers that might have been in this game for the past 10 years or they're experts. Some of them are even, some of them are paid to be there. The contracted parties are paid to be there. And here you are as an amateur coming into that and going, right, I would like to defend the end user interests, but you have to fight on a par basis, and it's sometimes quite onerous to do that.
How would you know what the end user interest is?
Now, it's a very good question, and this is why I'm very careful in describing how At-Large or the ALAC works. In the early days, I think the early documents were saying, well, the At-Large Advisory Committee represents end users. And how the hell can you represent 3.6 billion people out there? It's impossible. So one of the things that I like to say is we try and represent the interests, what we believe are the interests of the end users, because all of our component at-large structures are all made up of end users. There's one defining factor about at-large structures, and it's that they have a strong end user component. They relate directly with end users. And so by having this, so many at-large structures throughout the world, and I think we've reached now the 180 at-large structures on all 5 continents, we have an idea of what our members and the members of these at-large structures are concerned about. The idea, of course, is then you have to translate this into something that will fit within the remit of ICANN and within the remit of the policy development process that takes place. But in many cases, if I can just finish, in many cases, the end user has no idea whatsoever about what is being discussed there. And one of the challenges for the people who are actively involved in at-large is to translate the undecipherable stuff that comes out of those working groups, the acronym soup, as one would call it, and explain how does this affect an end user? How does the PEDNR, PEDNR, post-expiry domain name resolution working group resolutions affect the end user? Well, roughly translated, if you forget to renew your domain, what happens to it? Does it get put back in the pool and some domain speculator can pick it up like this? Or do you have a certain amount of time where you can still catch it before someone else takes it from you? And that was one of the working groups, GNSO working groups, that worked for over a year, I think a year and a half, to try and find a just solution so that people don't suddenly, by forgetting a domain, end up with someone telling them, I can give you your domain back, but it'll cost you $150,000, which unfortunately is something that happens.
I was just going to say that, as far as at-large structures, in New York, we only have two that I know of, and one is ISOC NY, and I'm the chief rep, and Avery Doria, is the other rep, and basically it's because the two of us are the only ones that have any kind of real knowledge of what, the ins and outs and the acronyms, and that there's plenty of other civic-minded groups here that, it's one of the reasons that I wanted Olivier to come in today, was to sort of maybe to try and, send out some sparks to other people as to why they should get involved in this. And you say, well, what difference does it make to me, about this? But I'll tell you that the next big PDP is going to be the who is.
Correct, yeah.
And, which is about whether, how the registry of people who actually own domain names, how public it's going to be, how searchable it's going to be, and how that's going to be structured. And it's something, even here in New York, we know that you cannot get a .nyc domain name without proving nexus to the city. You can't do that without giving an address. So if you're a private individual, you basically have no way to get a domain name. You can only, unless you're a business, you don't mind giving out your address, and because they don't allow proxies. At the same time, if someone's slandering you from a website, they've got a proxy on a .com, they've got a proxy at GoDaddy. There's no way that you can find out who they are without a complicated legal process.
The first problem, I think, is that end users don't know the difference between a country code top-level domain and a generic top-level domain. So when you get hate mail or you get slandered on a website, you have no idea who's behind this thing. And who is one of these things. Originally, who is was actually just a technical register of who the domain name owner was and who the technical contact was. And it was a case of, if your website or your devices registered under a certain domain were not working, there would be a reliable way to get in touch with somebody who could actually fix it. That was the original intent of who is. That, of course, it was never meant to be for the 10-year-old who decides to have a website and who registers a domain name and then has to give all of their details online, including a phone number, including their personal email, including their personal address. That was also not meant to be a register for an activist in a country that is undemocratic, and they need to give all of those details. Now, that complexity, that level of complexity, because we're trying to put everything into one basket, that level of complexity made it that who is has been a hot issue for very many years. On the one hand, you have the privacy advocates who are saying, well, people shouldn't need to give their personal details. And sure enough, as you said, there are some proxy services that have started up. They're for payment. But depending on where those proxy services are located, if the organization or country that asks for the details has nuclear weapons and is ready to ban you worldwide, the proxy provider might buckle and will provide the details of the real address. Of course, there's a lot of people that have registered domain names with fake addresses. And that's one of the things that the ICANN compliance department has to deal with, checking if the actual, by contract, by the way, people have to give their real address. The compliance department has been very tough on registrars and registries that do not maintain the reliable part, if you want, of that database. But the complexity of it all is such that they thought, well, let's put all of this aside and let's start something from scratch. Let's revisit the whole who is system from scratch, because the need to know about somebody who has registered a domain name and therefore is running a website differs depending on who the person is that is asking the question. If you're looking at law enforcement requires the details of a domain name, perhaps because of hate messages being on there, terrorism-related websites, scams, law enforcement, if you want, as such. And so they require a certain level of access. But you and I, who might just wish to find out who is the person behind the domain name, require it perhaps because if we're going to buy something from that website, we need to know just a few details. We don't need to know the whole thing of where they live personally and their phone number and stuff, but we need to have a reliable listing on in Whois that gives the real name of the company.
You just want to be able to know that you contacted that person, so that if you want to serve them a cease and desist or whatever, you can send it to them and know that they've received it without even having to necessarily know who they are.
Yeah.
But the thing was that they went through all this and they came up with the conclusion is that at the moment every registry is responsible for maintaining its own Whois. Mm-hmm. And so they came up with this proposal and said, we're all just going to put this into, as he said, one basket and run it all. And in fact, when everybody thought about, there being one database of every website owner in the world, they didn't think this was a good idea. And so this is why we went back to the table. But my point is that this policy development process is eventually going to come up with some policy which is going to affect every single person with a domain name on the entire planet. And the only way to have a say on this is either to get involved in the GNSO or via the at-large.
Yep.
And so my title of this today's discussion was, why you should care. And I think this is a pretty good example.
So in fact, it's funny because the Whois, as I said, the Whois discussions have gone on ever since the beginning of ICANN. And in fact, even before ICANN was created, there were discussions as to what information should be in that database. And we see now that with all of the leaks that take place, having a single database of every single domain owner with their real addresses and real telephone numbers and all that is something that could be marketable. And if anybody gets their hands on that and then sells it, I mean, you can make a lot of money out of that. So the facets, the problem around this are numerous. And rather than continuing to try to patch something that has not been good for anyone now, because it's basically something that was designed 30 years ago, the ICANN actually started an expert working group. That was the CEO, Fadi Shahade, asked for, and the board asked for an expert working group to come together and revisit the issue and think, well, if we had to redesign this whole thing from scratch, what would we do? And they wrote a position paper, which was then shown and presented to the community. And it was clear that there were some interesting ideas in that. And that's how the GNSO has decided to start a policy development process, taking that input plus the input of everyone else out there and saying, if we have to redesign everything from scratch, a clean slate Whois system, how do we do it? And we don't have a second shot for that. The previous one lasted, 30, 40 years, ever since the protocol was designed for this. We need to get this right. And this is why there needs to be really involvement from everyone in this. And not only from a single category of stakeholders. Of course, for intellectual property owners, they want to have everybody's details in there, including the name of their grandfather and grandmother and stuff, so they could just do cut and paste and do a cease and desist order, for example. But for privacy advocates and certainly organizations that ask, freedom of speech, that are involved in freedom of speech issues and so on, there needs to be, there's a different set of requirements that need to go in there, with certainly a number of safeguards with regards to who has access to that information and under what conditions. Should a commercial organization have access to that information if they pay for it, or and private information, or should there be a request from a judge for this information to be released? It's a very complex issue, and it's something that, Jolie, it's good that you flagged it, because we're just at the beginning of that.
What David would say if he had the mic, which I took from him, is that there are solutions, like blockchain for verifying that are coming with a new technologies that could kind of turn this whole thing on its head. But to go back to our original topic of IANA.
So that's one thing. Yep.
The IANA transition. How does that affect the end user?
Okay, so the IANA functions I mentioned to you a little bit earlier are purely technical functions where you have this a number of databases.
Sorry.
Oh, that's your code. Okay.
Yeah.
You have a number of databases. One database is the database of top-level domains, and that's otherwise known as the root. There's a database of IP addresses, which is all fed by the regional internet registries, since they coordinate the IP address allocation throughout the world. And there's also a database of protocols, which are all designed by the Internet Engineering Task Force. Protocols are, let's say, when you send an email out, there is a port number which your computer uses, which the other computer uses, and that's the same for every single computer around the world. So that's one thing. If you go on a website, there's another port number in the data that gets sent through, and so your computer knows what port. It's like different doors in a computer. Your computer knows which door to go to in the other machine. And sometimes there are more services that are being implemented, so it's a little bit like a standardization of the different doors in a computer. So Skype would run on a specific port, and FTP, File Transfer Protocol, would run on another one. This needs to be coordinated. There's not that many changes, maybe one or two a year sometimes. But this needs to be in a database that is available worldwide. So these are the three databases that have to be updated. The part of ICANN called IANA does this work, and it's only a department of like 8 people, 9 people. It's tiny.
Basically,
there's so little to do.
These are databases, but I mean, they're basically text files
Yep.
that aren't, like the whole top-level text file is probably only like 50K or I don't know, 100.
Tiny, yeah.
It's just like a little text file.
The one of top-level domains has grown significantly,
Yeah.
because we're 1,500 new or 1,400 new top-level domains have been created and released in the past year. But the other ones have not grown or not had any movement for years, or very little movement for years.
So the US government has said this should be transitioned to the internet community with a condition that no, it should not be run by governments.
So it's not quite that actually. So what the US government did about it just over a year ago, if you remember, the Snowden revelations came out, and until now this whole part of ICANN was, and the process by which these updates were being done was shepherded by the US government. And in the number of years, ever since the beginning, they never actually stopped the process from taking place. So even when it came down to Iran, for example, when the US was in bad terms with Iran, they never asked for .ir, the Iranian top-level domain, to be removed from the database. Because you can imagine, if you remove a top-level domain from a database, like you remove .uk, you effectively are crippling the UK internet. And that would be seen pretty much as an act of war one way or other. I mean, the repercussions would have been absolutely huge. So they actually never came in and said, no, you're not allowed to do that. But they were there to make sure that the policy by which a top-level domain was transferred from one organization to another was being followed. And they would have stepped in if ICANN had not actually followed those policies. Now, with the Snowden revelations, the level of trust, I guess, in the US government somehow was lowered, I would say. Compromised is the right word. And of course, the Snowden and IANA have got nothing in common, at all. But certainly that level of trust in the US government in performing this function and having the ability to remove somebody from the root was a concern, and there were more and more calls by countries that might have not been so trustful of the US that they really needed to step back. And as a result, they announced that they were going to step back. But there needed to be this kind of stewardship of these functions. Now, when it comes down to the protocols, and when it comes down to the IP addresses, that's a simple thing. It's a simple thing because the protocols and the IP addresses are all actually run by these other two organizations, the Regional Internet Registries and the Internet Engineering Task Force. And they can basically keep a watch over ICANN, that you know, the IANA functions, and make sure that whatever instructions they give is done correctly. When it comes down to ICANN, that's a more difficult thing because the policy itself is done by the ICANN communities. But on top of that, any policy has to go through the ICANN board. At the end of the day, the ICANN board has to basically, I wouldn't say rubber stamp, but it certainly have to say, right, so this policy will move forward. And then you have this problem of having both policy on one side and implementation on the other side performed by the same organization. And this is why there was a concern in the ICANN community that if you leave all powers to the board with regards to this, you effectively have judge and jury on the same side. And ICANN, if one day ICANN went rogue, ICANN as in ICANN staff or ICANN board went rogue, there would be absolutely no way to counter it. And we would be in a difficult situation. If the IANA functions were not performed properly, well, you know, there could be complaints from the community and saying, well, you know, the domain name system doesn't work well anymore. What happens then? What recourse do you have against the organization that is supposed to do its job if that organization is not doing its job? And this is where the communities...
This is the accountability process.
There's the accountability on one side with the board going rogue, and there's also the quality of the services offered by IANA. Now, when it comes down to the services offered by IANA, there are service level expectations for those 9 people that are working in this. So if you send an update to IANA just by email, you should get an answer within 4 hours. I'm just taking numbers, you know, sort of example numbers. So 4 hours, you get an answer. Within 24 hours, the update is done. And there are no errors to whatever you've sent. If the IETF sends a request to ICANN and ICANN repeatedly does not, or the IANA repeatedly doesn't perform the function, the IETF can suddenly say, you know what, I'm going to take my business elsewhere. You know, database, forget about, and we're going to set up our own database with another provider. Same thing with the regional internet registries. But if it comes down to the naming issues, the top-level domains, because ICANN is the policy making arm that builds the policy for the top-level domains, and is also the implementation of it, there is no way that you could have a separation or the community saying, well, you know, we're going to take that away from you. And this is where a certain number of, a certain system had to be implemented so as to have this ability to separate if everything goes wrong. That's where the thing is, and that's where the crux of the problem was. So the IANA Stewardship Transition Cross-Community Working Group worked on various ways to be able to achieve this. The version 1 of the proposal was one where a completely separate organization would be created and would be the organization that would actually be the contracting party that would sign a deal with ICANN and say, right, you know, we own the top-level domains and we will sign a contract with ICANN and IANA will basically maintain that database, and if one day we're unhappy with it, we reserve the right to be able to cut that link and take our business elsewhere. That was seen as being an absolute risk by many people in the community, and at large included, because what happens if the supposed owner of that database at that point goes rogue themselves? What is the level of accountability that you have in that separate contract company that would sign the contract with ICANN? So the first level of the first feedback, comment period had a lot of people communicating this concern, and the cross-community working group went back to the drawing board and rethought the whole thing from scratch and said, well, what can we do? What they did come up with was a system where you would have a wholly owned subsidiary of ICANN that would be the post-transition IANA, that would be running the functions. So you turn the tables around. Now you don't have contracting authority that owns the database. You now keep the database where it is, but you have a post-transition IANA that will run the functions. And if that goes wrong, then you can chop the post-transition IANA out of the equation and start with a new organization that will be able to do this.
Subsidiary to ICANN.
Subsidiary, wholly owned subsidiary to ICANN. It would have, it would be very lean, so it has a board, but the board is, because these are purely technical functions, it would be made up of the chief technical officer of ICANN. It would be made up with the director of IANA, which is a separate person. It would have maybe a couple of the direct customers of these functions, and they would just be they wouldn't have any power to take any decisions or anything like that, except in internal matters of personnel and you know, sort of how the functions are run internally. There would be a customer standing committee that is created. In fact, I've got a slide on this, but the customer standing committee is created. That's purely composed of registries and registrars, because they are the organizations that send the updates to IANA. And so they're the first ones. If IANA doesn't perform, if the whole thing doesn't run well, they're the first ones who are going to find out there's a problem here. And the only thing that they have, though, the only power that they have is to then escalate the matter and say, hang on, something is wrong. We're not getting the service level that we should be getting. Once it raises its flag, then the another working group would be created and made up by the different communities of ICANN, and that working group or that committee, if you want, would be would be balanced with stakeholders from various parts of ICANN, and they are the ones who would then be looking at the problem and seeing if it can be resolved. If it cannot be resolved, I guess it's a long escalation, but ultimately, if all else goes wrong, there would be the ability of a separation of the IANA functions to take place from ICANN. 99% of the time was spent in the working group looking at that very worst case scenario, making sure that the system could not be gamed, so you wouldn't have a single organization or single stakeholder who maybe hated ICANN's guts and decided, right, we're going to split those functions, or to use the system so as to split those functions without a proper escalation and proper safeguards for it to endanger the stability of the domain name system. So they were very careful about having that escalation.
Was when they say about going rogue, I mean, the concern was that there's certain companies, you know, that you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, that are so big that they could just take complete control of this thing, and so that everything has to go through them, and it doesn't go through the system at all. You know what I mean? So now, you know, so instead of going to a web, then you have to make your website on Facebook or on Google or something, because they, you know, so it was, you know, it was a real thing. But it's and obviously one wants to, in terms of public good, to maintain the integrity of the entire internet end to end, to be able to reach people in other countries. So you want to sort of have someone making sure that things don't get cut off, you know, basically from the top.
Yeah.
You know, so, and it's this is one of the great ironies, that in order to have a distributed end-to-end system, you need to have this hierarchical, you know, structure of domain names.
But you need to have that whole system to be accountable. And if you make it accountable to a single entity, then who is that single entity accountable to? It's that recursive accountability problem that you have. And in here, what we have is, you can see you've got the customers. So the direct customers are effectively the registries and registrars that use the IANA services. You've got the customer standing committee that is here. And then there's this post-transition IANA that is created here with a board. And there is a legal separation between ICANN and the ICANN board, and the post-transition IANA with the post-transition IANA board. And that contract is what warrants the ability to basically cut the contract if everything goes wrong. The IANA functions review team that is here is as I said, is a group that is either created if the customer standing committee flags things and says something is wrong, something needs to be done about this, and the GNSO, the Generic Name Supporting Organization, looks at it and says, that's right, we have to create an IANA functions review team, or every 3 years, I think it is every 3 years, it might be 2, but I think it is every 3 years, there would be an actual automatic functions review to find out and look at all of the IANA reports and say, has IANA actually performed according to the service level expectations? And the whole process here, this is where there's something that's very important, this whole process is actually shepherded by new accountability mechanisms that would feed in from the cross-community working group on accountability. That's where the two things come together, because on the one hand you have the stewardship transition, but on the other hand you have the wider accountability of ICANN itself. And that's the second part, I guess, of the discussion we can have. Go ahead.
Were the accountability mechanisms always part of the post-transition roadmap?
So,
or was it a response to something that happened?
So the accountability cross-community working group started its work after the cross-community working group on IANA stewardship transition. In fact, it started much later. There was always a view that the accountability work needed to move forward, but it was certainly a request by the cross-community working group on IANA stewardship transition to have a solution that included a certain amount of accountability changes in ICANN. And that there was a need for an essential component of changes to ICANN's accountability and enhancement to ICANN's accountability in the overall proposal that they came up with. Version 1 of the proposal, which had this whole thing about creating an external organization that IANA would be accountable to, might have not needed any accountability mechanisms, because ultimately this other organization would have just taken been the overseer, if you want, the steward of everything that was taking place. But as I said earlier, that was considered to be too dangerous to have another organization that was not accountable or that needed to have its own accountability mechanisms as well. So that's what they came up with. The way that it all then fed into it was that, so here we're jumping in the middle of a presentation here, but this is just about the process. You've got the 3 different operational communities that have built a proposal. So the CWG stewardship is the ICANN naming side, the CRISP were the regional internet registries, and IANA Plan where was the working group from the Internet Engineering Task Force. These three proposals went into this IANA stewardship coordination group, ICG, which was made up of a whole number of people that were not even part of either ICANN or any of the operational communities. It was a very open, multi-stakeholder group chosen from many different organizations. And that proposal is ready, actually, and went over to the ICANN board. And in the meantime, we've had to wait for the work of the cross-committee working group on accountability to come up with its own proposal and to feed into the ICANN board. Once the board is satisfied by these 2 proposals, and with regards to the ICG proposal, by the way, the board has said that they will just transfer it straight through over to the NTIA without making any changes. With regards to the CCWG proposal, the one on accountability, the board has said they will not make any changes, but they will certainly comment on this. And they will forward this to the NTIA with their own comments about this. Once it goes to the NTIA, you've got here the accountability proposal. You'll have public comment period that is open for the CCWG accountability proposal. That's what we're just starting now on the 1st of December. Once that is finished, there'll be a couple of weeks for the communities to look at the feedback, which was, the cross-committee working group to look at the feedback that was received. It is hoped that there's no massive pushback against this. I mean, this is now the 3rd public comment period as far as ICANN accountability is concerned. How many more could you have? Hopefully they've got it right by now. Yeah, Jolie, you're laughing. I know. But you cannot have something that's going to be perfect. But this is the best they could come up with. And the multi-stakeholder community will deliver this over to the National Telecommunication Infrastructure Administration. I think that's what the NTIA is. The NTIA will take 60 to 90 days to look at the proposal and to prepare a report. And then they have to send it to the dreaded US Congress. And they have to, and that report and that whole proposal needs to be sent there in 30 L days, which apparently means something in congressional terms. I guess it's 30 working days. There will be a congressional review, and if the Congress signs up on this and says, fine, we're okay with it, then the implementation will then take place. The actual use of both the accountability proposal and the transition proposal will move forward, and there'll be a continued work with the overall the groups of the CCWG accountability and the proposal from the ICG to be implemented. But at the same time, there's also going to be some work done in parallel for bylaw changes, because the working group on accountability has recommended some bylaw changes at ICANN level. So work will start on this. It is hoped that the bylaw changes will be adopted before the congressional review, but that's not sure yet. We're now seeing a few more delays, but what's important is that things do move forward, and the accountability stream has actually a second work stream that has a lot of other issues that they wish to move forward with for ICANN, and that's likely to last into future years. Certainly the work will continue next year as well. I wonder if I can show you the latest accountability discussion, and that actually this is a webinar that was given a couple of days ago on the draft proposal of the workstream 1 recommendation from the cross-community working group on ICANN accountability. This you've already seen. I've shown you just a moment ago. This is just more stylized. I guess they paid some designers to make it look even better than before. The background you now know already. You can see ICANN community is not good at preparing small reports. 57 pages for this one. I think it was 90-something pages for the other report. We have 20 days, actually less than 20 days now that we're the 4th of December, to review those 57 pages and come up with feedback on this. Yeah, you'll notice, by the way, core proposal is 57 pages, but there are 10 appendices. In case you feel bored at night. Translations will be provided in Arabic, Spanish, French, Russian, Chinese, and Portuguese. But due to the size of the report, it's not known when they will be ready, and that's a big concern for us. Of course, you might say, but why do we have such a crunched timeline? And one of the problems is that the US elections are coming up. And it's been known that the NTIA has wanted to complete the process before we start engaging into these heavy election discussions, because if you start bringing this purely technical transition into a political games period, that would be totally pushed aside, and it might never happen. And you might end up with this being taken as a bargaining chip between the different parties and so on. And it would just be detrimental to the whole process, especially after all the work that's been done to actually reach the level now of coming up with a proposal. So there are 4 building blocks to the accountability discussions. There were principles with golden bylaws being implemented. So fundamental bylaws, you can't call them golden initially, but now they're called fundamental bylaws that would be implemented so that the ICANN board could not change those bylaws except if there was agreement from the community. There are some new bylaws being added, some new mechanisms, some new review processes, internal review processes, and there's also a mention of human rights in there, and I think it's a very good thing that ICANN is also aligning itself with regards to that. There are new independent appeals and review mechanisms. There's an improved recall process, which Because until now, whenever the ICANN board made a decision, the decision was final. And if you wanted to, if you disagree with it, you could always appeal. But the appeal would just be considered on process grounds. So if the board had followed due process to make its decision, it was very unlikely, if actually total zero chance, that the board would change its mind and change its decision. .xxx was one, perhaps the only time when this happened, but you have to remember, the initial decision was made by one board 3 or 4 years earlier, and then the whole matter was handled in such a way, I hasten to say maybe mishandled in such a way, that the case of the .xxx applicant was so strong, the board had two choices, either to go and say yes, or to say no, and then to be sued, and 6 months later having to say yes because a court would have given the green light for the complainant. So it was a tough decision, and the board did not. There was no full consensus on the board. It was a very split decision, but they finally gave that. And that's a huge story. .xxx. The ICANN board of directors. So there's a building block based around that, and there's the building block about an empowered ICANN community, a community that is able to, that has 5 new community powers. And maybe we can jump to those because I'm well aware of the time and I don't want to overflood you with words and so on. But so these are the ones. So the first community power was being able to reject the budget or the strategic operating plan. So far, the community was involved in building the budget, the ICANN budget, with ICANN staff, with the board, but the sole decider at the end was the ICANN board. And that's of course because the ICANN board has a fiduciary duty through the laws of California. By the laws of California, they're accountable to ICANN, the organization. They're not accountable to the community when it comes down to decisions of finance, when it comes down to decisions that they have to make with regards to ICANN. So the first thing the community managed to have is to have the ability now to reject the budget using a certain set of parameters to be able to do that. It also has the ability to reject changes to ICANN standard bylaws. It has the ability to approve changes to fundamental bylaws. It has the ability, or it would, sorry, I'm saying it has, but it hasn't gone through yet. I'm jumping ahead of time. It would have the ability to remove individual ICANN board directors. So far, the current status is that ICANN board directors can only be removed by their peers. So if a board director does not behave or goes rogue or whatever, or ends up being a crook or something, only the other board members would be able to hold a vote and kick that person out. So here, the community would have the ability to do that. There's also the ability to recall the entire ICANN board. So that's the worst case scenario. If the whole board goes rogue and decides, right, we have $200 million in the bank, what island are we going to go to and what holiday are we going to have? I'm laughing, but you know, this is the sort of thing, a silly extreme, but there might be other extremes or other chances that the board goes rogue. So the community would be able to recall the whole board and kick them out and ask and basically select new directors. And there's also a community independent review process, which I mentioned earlier. So if the board takes a decision that the community decides is not what they have instructed the board to do, and that goes against the wishes of the community, then the community has would have a process by which they could overrule the board. And also reject ICANN board decisions relating to IANA functions reviews. So these are the different community powers that have been afforded. Yeah.
Who is the community?
Yes.
Now, that's it. It's an interesting point, yes. So the model which was taken, there were several models were looked at to build, to have this community being represented or having some kind of a legal standing. Because in the US, as you well know, if you don't have the ability to sue or to engage in a lawsuit, you can always say, I'm telling you to do this. The other party might tell you, yeah, you can tell me whatever you want. We're not bound to do what you're telling us to do. So there was this big concern about if you're going to have just a committee or something, an informal committee or even a formal committee within ICANN, it would have absolutely no power to get the board to do something unless it had legal standing of some sort. And therefore, the way that it was built, I don't even know, maybe we have it... do we have it somewhere here? Dun, 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 dun. Maybe we don't have the details in here. So what you would have is initially the working group was thinking of having some kind of a membership model. Because if you have a membership model, for example, the different supporting organizations and advisory committees would all become members of ICANN. They would have the ability to instruct the board to do things, and they could, if they had legal standing, so the ALAC could have a legal standing, the generic name supporting organization would have legal standing. Each one of these organizations could come together and sue ICANN, or sue the ICANN board, as the board being the representatives for ICANN. That was seen as being a bit of a danger, because if one of the members decided that they wanted to close down ICANN, the powers that they would have as a member, strictly speaking, legally wise, would basically give them the ability to shut down ICANN under a certain set of conditions. But under some extremes, they would be able to shut down ICANN. I imagine the danger of this happening. It's one of these things. Remember, we're talking about technical functions to start with. This is stability. Why would you start to introduce something that might shut down the organization that is actually coordinating the domain name system? It was seen as being too dangerous. So the way that they've done it is through a single designator model. And the signal designator model is one where you'd have all of the ICANN communities, so the supporting organizations and advisory committees that would come together as a committee that would be a designator, and that designator would have the power to sue, it would have all of the powers, if you want, that would be done through a membership model, but without having the powers of being able to dissolve ICANN or to close it down. Or there are some safeguards that you can give, that you can design into the bylaws and so on for what that designator is able to do or what that designator is not able to do. So that's why they went for this. And this, of course, was discussed ad infinitum with legal firms, and a huge bill came out of that, because one needed to be absolutely sure that the model that was going to be proposed was going to be one, acceptable by the board and acceptable to NTIA, and also as stable and as difficult to capture as possible. So for each one of these community powers, there is a set of, where do we go? Turn the other way. Here we go. There is an escalation process. Now I realize it's very small over here, but let's say we're looking at the, so here there's the escalation. Yeah, so here we go. So we start with a single individual beginning an online petition in any advisory committee or supporting organization. If the petition is approved, then it goes to the next stage. And approval of the petition goes through the advisory committees and supporting organization establishing a conference call. First, establishing if a conference call about the matter should be held. Once there is that, the next level is to find out if there's actual support from an additional advisory committee or supporting organization. Then you've got that conference call that takes place that then decides whether there should be some kind of resolution coming out of this, of a community power to be taken forward. Then that moves over to the next level, which is the empowered community mechanism. If the community forum should be held, if a community forum should be held, then we have a second thing, the community forum that is being created. that again is made up of ICANN's communities, and it might be also that it might include people from outside the ICANN community, but this is always something depending on what the actual problem will be. And then the community discusses things with the board, and if they find a resolution, no problem. You know, the problem is resolved. But if it's not, then you can then you have to continue further, and then there's a threshold depending on what is it that you want to do. So if you want to kick a board director out, there needs to be a vote by the different parts of the community, and if it reaches a certain threshold, then that director will be removed from the board. And so it will, the community will notify the board of its decision. So every single power is roughly following this type of escalation mechanism. So when you look at the thresholds, that's the details, the level, you know, the devil is in the details, as in everything. When you look at that, then you can see that if you want to reject a proposed operating plan or strategic budget plan, you need to have 2 advisory committees or supporting organizations to say, yes, we want to block it. You need to have 3 advisory committees or supporting organizations to say, yes, we want to block it for a community forum to be convened. And if there is a consensus to support existing, to exercise a community power, there needs to be 4 of the advisory committees and supporting organizations to support a rejection, and no more than 1 objection. That's the level of detail that it's gone into to make sure that you cannot just have a single organization in ICANN. And Jolie mentioned earlier the GNSO, and David, you mentioned also the GNSO that might be somehow captured by commercial entities and so on. Well, you can imagine the GNSO by itself cannot just reject the operating plan or the strategic plan. It would have to really build a good consortium of all of the other parts of ICANN to be able to put something like that through. And that ensures that a budget on an operating plan would only be blocked if it really was a bad budget or a bad operating plan, or it was a budget where the board members decided they would use the money to go and take a nice holiday somewhere.
What role does the large have within this?
At large is one of the advisory committees, so we're pretty much on par with the supporting organizations. When one looks at the different component parts of ICANN, you've only got 3 supporting organizations, and you've got, is it 4 or 5 advisory committees? But the ones that are, the Security and Stability Advisory Committee is a purely technical advisory committee, and they've already said in advance that they might not be so interested in taking part in such powers because, 1, they're purely technical, and so they don't indulge in politics and so on, and 2, they might not even have the manpower to be able to pursue this sort of thing. Plus, a single SSAC member is not able to represent the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. Only the chair of the Security and Stability Advisory Committee is able to represent them, and even with a document in his or her hands, because they're technical. They're not going to start haggling over the fact that something is not working. It either works or it doesn't. So that's, and you can see each one of those different cases has different levels of thresholds. And believe me, this is the result of months and months of negotiations and work and people trying to strangle each other. And you know, it's an incredible amount of discussions and frustration, but at the same time, the result in itself is something that I personally believe is very, is certainly very mature and has a lot of safeguards included in there. So these community powers might be very strong. Being able to kick the board out is a very strong power, but it could only happen if you had, recall the entire board of directors, it could only happen if you had 4 of the supporting organizations and advisory committees in support and no more than 1 objection. You just need 1 objection in there and the board will not be spilled. So the rest of this is looking at each one of the escalation scenarios for removal of the board directors, etc. I mean, they're all pretty much the same sort of process as I've mentioned earlier. And there are, I've spoken about the bylaws. There are a few changes here. So there's first, because there are some bylaw changes, it was felt that a few bylaws needed to be somehow changed as well because they were ambiguous or they did not describe ICANN as it is today. ICANN's mission, commitments, and core values are going to become fundamental bylaws because up to now, if you remember, ICANN has a contract with the US government, not only for the IANA contract, but the affirmation of commitments is the contract that ICANN has with the US Department of Commerce to say we agree to adhere to the following guidelines, if you want. And one of them is to act for the public interest. The other one is to conduct reviews of each one of its component parts at regular intervals. The other one is to ensure a stable internet, a stable domain name system or system of identifiers, etc., etc. And so if the US government steps back out of the IANA functions, but also lets the affirmation of commitments lapse, then what do we have that makes sure that ICANN remains accountable? The affirmation of commitments will be out. There needs to be something else. And that's where the fundamental bylaws come in. Folding what is in the affirmation of commitments into the bylaws, making these fundamental so that the board cannot just say, well, that's really great, thank you very much, but now we're going to take all of that, put it in the bin, and we'll be back to the good old days. That is very important. And then finally also a limitation on the actual mission of ICANN, because so far, if you look at the ICANN bylaws, there wasn't that much of a focus on ICANN's mission, and in some way there was some ability to expand ICANN's mission into going into internet governance and doing all sorts of things. And one critical thing is that ICANN doesn't deal with content. So if you have a website, ICANN deals with the domain name, but the content on that website has nothing to do with ICANN. And so more and more people seem to think, oh, you know, this website talks about XYZ, I don't like it, we're going to tell ICANN to take it down. Well, it's not for ICANN to judge any of this stuff. And you know, this is where this needs to be clarified. And so the bylaws, the changes to the bylaws would actually clarify this and make sure that ICANN does not deal with content on the internet, doesn't deal with internet access, doesn't deal with you know, anything else but with the identifiers themselves. What else? So the rest of it, I mean, the rest of the presentation is just further details. Did I just skip? Oh, here we go. Yeah. So here's the human rights slide. So that's something which has come in the, I would say, in the latter stage of the cross-community working group on accountability discussions. In ICANN, ICANN, by assuming its role, it's a private sector organization. At the end of the day, it's registered in California. It's a not-for-profit organization. But it's private sector, it's not a government. And yet it is assuming a critical function for the internet that could have been assumed by governments, but that was better assumed by a private sector organization. And so if you are going to uphold yourself to such levels of integrity and accountability, it was strongly felt by many members in the ICANN community that since these days there is a strong emphasis on governments adhering to human rights, having of course signed up on the International Chart of Human Rights, as a private sector organization it would also need to have a certain component part of adhering to human rights. And of course it becomes a little bit more complicated because human rights are a huge thing, and you can use human rights for all sorts of reasons. You know, you could say, well, you're by not giving me this top-level domain that I have applied for. So let's say top-level domain dot. Think of your favorite swear word. something super, no, .Nazi, yeah, something offensive, yeah? And a Nazi, I think, is pretty offensive to pretty much everyone. .Nazi. And you go out there and you apply for it and it gets refused. Of course, the Government Advisory Committee would be the first ones to object to it, but there are also, I think pretty much everyone would object to it. Well, that person could say, but hang on, you know, ICANN adheres to human rights. You are stopping my freedom of speech by not allocating .Nazi to me. So one had to word this very carefully so as to not provide the ability to actually act in the worst cases, if you want, and act in a way that would be detrimental to the general public good by having the human rights in there. And this is why the mission of ICANN being limited, the linking with human rights had to also be worded in a certain way that would limit it to the Internet's identifiers and to the exact mission of ICANN. In parallel with this, actually, there is a cross-community working party that was created about a year ago within ICANN that is looking specifically at the human rights directives and so on, and is looking at perhaps producing further documents on how ICANN could do things in a way that would support human rights. Certainly, I guess in our countries, you know, the free world, or we would think, well, what's so important about human rights? We take this for granted, but you have to remember the majority of countries out there do not have free speech and are much worse at their record on human rights than the countries that we're used to be in. So this is an important fact, and something that needed to be folded in there. So here it says, within its mission and in its operations, ICANN will respect internationally recognized human rights. This commitment does not in any way create an obligation for ICANN or any entity having a relationship with ICANN to protect or enforce human rights beyond what may be required by applicable law. So don't start then, once you talk about, you know, once you put this in the bylaws that ICANN will respect human rights, do not use ICANN as a tool in your country or in specific cases as a tool for promoting human rights in a certain way. It's not ICANN's mission to promote human rights. It's ICANN's mission to run the domain name system technically and produce policies that will continue evolving as the internet evolves. So I think that pretty much captures it quite well. And it says here in particular, this does not create any additional obligation for ICANN to respond to or to consider any complaint, request, or demand seeking the enforcement of human rights by ICANN. And that relates to the idea that if you want to register .Nazi, ICANN says no, and you say, no, that's my freedom of speech, you're breaking this. It doesn't give any obligation on ICANN to say, oh yes, it's your freedom of speech, we have to give it back to you. We'll see how that is accepted. I'm sure there will be some comments on this. Human rights advocates wanted perhaps a little bit more than this, but the working group in itself found the consensus to be this as something that will cover it, but at the same time that will not give additional powers for anyone who is very knowledgeable about being able to use this for a totally different purpose. So, and that's the draft bylaw text, by the way. So remember, we've just started the comment period, so if you feel differently, please comment on that. It's important as well. So enhancing the accountability of supporting organizations. Now this was seen...
Just clarify, where would people comment on that?
I'll show you in a moment. There is actually a link to the comment period. I hope that it is there actually. Was it before? Yeah. I've got a page that's got it, and you can write down the details, because this one was only given 2 days ago, and I wonder whether they've actually put because that's the last work stream 2. No, this one doesn't have it. I've got another. Here we go. Yeah, there you go. Public comments survey closes on the 21st of December. So that's the one. surveymonkey.com, CCWG accountability draft proposal. And if you want to have a look at the actual thing itself, I hope that I've got internet. Have I got internet? Does it work? Da-da-da-da. Hopefully that will load up one day. You click on that, you've got the full report that is on there, and you've got the public commenting page that is on there. We also have an at-large public comment page if you wish to add your comments to the at-large one. Let's try, see if that one works. Maybe we've lost internet or it's very slow. Yeah, very slow. It's the time when people check their emails, isn't it, or go home and stuff. So. Yeah, no, I've got it. I'm on there. I'm connected. Yeah, connecté, as it says. It's just very slow. Never mind. Ooh, we've lost the other one. Where are we now? So that's the different things. Now, as I mentioned to you, there is, I think we can have a look at this. So here we go. The timeline is as follows. By the 30th of November. So now we're in the 21-day public comment period. There's a detailed report, annexes and appendices all being published. By December the 21st, that comment period closes. The staff is going to work between the 21st and just before Christmas Eve for a distribution summary. And guess what? They have a target time, otherwise they're not going to have any partying or any relaxing over the holiday period. Then there are a few days until there's an analysis by the actual working group. And then the amended report will be sent to the chartering organizations on the 7th of January. As in every cross-community working group in ICANN, the supporting organizations and advisory committees charter that working group to do a job. Once the output is there, it goes back to the chartering organizations and they all have to sign up on it. So if one of the organizations says, chartering organization says, no, we're not interested, rubbish, we don't support this, no one knows. It would be better that all of them would be supporting it. There's a difference between not supporting it and and objecting to it. So you could, chartering organization could say, we're not supporting this, but that would be seen as an abstention. And you could also say, we absolutely vehemently oppose this. At that point, that would be a lot more serious, and that might have the possibility of stopping the whole process and bringing it back to the drawing board. So that's where there is a concern, so far the feedback from the chartering organizations, because they all had people in this process, has been pretty positive, and so it's quite likely that all of the chartering organizations will either agree and say yes, we endorse this, or might abstain. But it's not seen that they would go against it. However, there is one specific chartering organization, and that's the Government Advisory Committee, that might be a little bit more tricky, because the members of the Government Advisory Committee that were part of that working group cannot represent the Government Advisory Committee, because they're all people that represent governments. And often they've worked as individuals rather than referring back to their government on every single discussion that has taken place there. So it looks as though the Government Advisory Committee now has to do its work in being able to reach a consensus on whether they support, they abstain, or they reject the proposals. And that's where the idea of GAC consensus is important, because the GAC works where a consensus of the GAC is a full consensus, which means everyone agrees, there are no objections. If there is one objection, then the GAC is not able to, or more than one objection. Within the GAC is not able to reach consensus, and therefore the GAC will not emit any thoughts on this process, and therefore the GAC will abstain. But it's unlikely that the GAC will go against the, and reject the report, because they would need to have consensus on rejecting the report. And it's quite likely that with the United States being part of the GAC, they will object to the GAC objecting about the report, which means that a double objection means there's an abstention coming out of it.
This is the whip hand of the elections coming up that's going to drive, because they want the GAC, basically everybody, including the United States, wants to see it go through.
Not all of them. Some don't. And this is where there are weird questions. Some parties might not want this to go through. Some parties might think, and certainly in the Congress, some parties might think, well, hang on, this internet is a US thing.
But within the GAC?
Within the GAC, there are some parties that might say, maybe we don't want it this way, because if the GAC loses power on anything in there, then maybe we don't want we don't want the solution. Or even better, if we get, some countries
keeps Benny in his job.
Some countries might say, hey, if this thing doesn't go through, it's not only going to be embarrassing to the US Department of Commerce, it's going to be embarrassing to ICANN. Yeah, let's try and shoot it down. Who knows? The thing is, of course, they're all playing with their cards very close to them, so no one knows really what will happen. And I guess, I don't know if Benny can comment, but it's one of these things where nobody really knows how it's going to go. There's been one thing that's been really tough on the GAC, one discussion which has practically monopolized all of the GAC interaction on the thing of accountability. And that's a thing called Stress Test 18. So one of the component parts of the report of the stewardship transition and the ICANN accountability is to have a list of stress tests, to have tested the proposal against case scenarios of things going wrong, and to see how this proposal fares. So give you an idea, if it was a car, if a pedestrian runs in front of your car, what happens? Well, you press the brakes and the car stops. Perfect. You passed the stress test. Now, of course, what if the brakes fail? Well, you need to have two sets of circuits for the brakes with a backup one, so that in any case the car will stop. Or you need to have a light that turns on as soon as the brakes fail, so you know before you have to stop. This sort of thing.
The other question is, do you test the brakes on real people or crash test dummies?
They usually do crash test dummies before that. But that's the sort of thing that they wanted also. So any of the proposals needed to go via some kind of a stress test. And one of those stress tests is the one where the Government Advisory Committee provides advice to the board. And the way that the Government Advisory Committee has a special relationship and a special thing on the board, in that if the ALAC, the Ad Hoc Advisory Committee, provides advice to the board is free to take it or leave it. In the current ICANN bylaws, if the Government Advisory Committee provides advice to, and with a capital A, as in we want you to do this, to the board, if the board does not agree with this advice and says, well, we don't want to do that, it can't just push it aside. It actually has to go and discuss this back with the board. I wouldn't say negotiate, but certainly come back to the board and say, right, let's sit around the table, let's see why you want this. And let's find, if we can find some middle ground. If they cannot find a middle ground and the board rejects the GAC advice, the board has to provide real details and reasons, proper compelling reasons for not accepting the advice. So advice from the Government Advisory Committee is pretty important. Now, stress test 18 is a stress test that basically says, well, what if the GAC provides advice that is not consensus advice? So what if the GAC has a majority of countries that decide that ICANN should hand over the domain name system to the United Nations? Say that. Do we want that advice to be so strong as the board needing to go into a negotiation with a GAC and then needing to provide exact reasons why the domain name system should not be transferred over to the United Nations? And that was seen as being a risk of governments trying to control, trying to use their special relationship with the ICANN board and with ICANN in being able to capture ICANN one way or other. So stress test 18 is basically saying that maybe the way around that is if the board receives advice from the GAC, then it should be consensus advice based on the current definition of consensus on the GAC, which is unanimous consensus, i.e. no objection.
So if the United States objected, basically
the GAC is not able to provide advice.
And what they have to do is that on the NTIA's request for the proposal, it had to be in there that governments cannot take over.
Correct. The big concern of the United States and of the NTIA is that this vacuum of them coming out means it opens the door to another country wanting to step in, or a group of countries wanting to step in and take over the role. It's always been a concern. At the very beginning, when ICANN was created, the US government made this conscious decision that they wanted the domain name identifiers to be run by a private sector run organization. They did not want this to be run by governments. That was the first step. And so in taking their step back, the primary concern is they don't want this to turn back and for governments to be able to step in, and certainly ICANN would be run by governments. So the US Department of Commerce has been very clear and saying if stress test 18 is not part of this, if this whole definition of consensus advice is not in the report, then that will not fly through Congress. And therefore the transition is off the table. They've been very clear on this.
But this is their key to getting it past Congress, because otherwise...
It's their key to getting it past Congress, because it would go directly... If this was not part of it, then there would be a chance that governments could take over ICANN at some point through whatever measures, and Benny, you probably know better the overall geopolitics of what kind of games the countries play. But if it's not in there, transition wouldn't happen. Now, there are some countries in the GAC who believe that this is actually not right. That the US government, by doing this, is basically preserving its veto, its power to veto decisions of the GAC. Irrespective of the fact that they could also use themselves that same veto if they wanted to. But that's a different thing. And they think very strongly that the GAC should be able to define its own power on how it reaches a decision, and should define its own consensus. And if there is no consensus, it should perhaps go to a vote. So there should be a vote on the GAC. But that's something for the GAC itself to work out. And so the really, at that point, what you're saying is that the decision and the discussion shouldn't take place on this accountability working group anymore. It's not even part of the transition. It's part of the way that the GAC works and how the GAC relates to the board, but it's not something that they can bring into this. And that's why there's been a big, long discussion and concern that it's just gone on for way too long. And the GAC is likely to continue its discussions within the next weeks, months, I guess, to find out whether they will allow this or not allow this. But it's been interesting to see how the GAC has become polarized. You've got countries like Brazil, I think France as well, a couple of other countries that have been very adamant that they don't want the stress test 18 as it currently is. And you've had the United States, who's been very, very adamant that they want stress test 18 to be there. I'm not quite sure where they will go. It might well be that they will not reach consensus on the meaning of consensus as it is there, and therefore the GAC might be one of the one of the advisory committees that does not actually sign off and say, yes, we support this. But it's pure speculation, because at the end of the day, what happens on the GAC between countries, sometimes things suddenly fall in place, and they might reach consensus on it. So, but it's certainly made an enormous amount of noise and taken an enormous amount of time for GAC members.
Good name for a band, Stress Test 18.
Stress Test 18, exactly. So that's the overall thing. I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, we could wrap up, Olivier.
Yeah. Well, there's Accountability Working Group 2, Work Stream 2. After the transition, after all of this is over, the work is not finished. As you can see, there's going to be a lot more work on enhancing diversity and the accountability of the supporting organizations and advisory committees, very important as well. We've now had some components of making the board accountable, but what about the supporting organizations and advisory committees? And I fully support it. You know, I was chair of ALAC for 4 years, but sometimes I was thinking, you know what? It would be so great if we actually had a certain number of mechanisms. We don't have a system where if the ALAC takes a decision on something, there can be a recall process, you know, or a review process of ALAC decisions. There's no such thing. There's no review process of a GNSO decision. There's no such thing.
You know,
So-
it's a thing that we don't really have time to go into, but it's, you know, how to like build the at-large community beyond what it is, you know, to a wider thing, and whether more resources should come to it from ICANN in terms of outreach, you know, road shows, this kind of thing. You know.
The outreach is one thing, getting more people involved, but in-reach within the communities that we already have, in-reach within ISOC New York, in-reach with the different at-large structures we have around the world is very important as well. One of the things we have found is that the language that is spoken at ICANN is sometimes so out of this world, you know, so restricted with acronyms and so uninteresting to the end user that we don't have the level of involvement that we would like to have. And the at-large, we've conducted an at-large review. We also had an at-large summit that took place in London last year in June 2014 that came up with, I think it was 39 recommendations or 49 recommendations, including some that were there to make sure that at-large can relate better to end users and have more resources to be able to do that.
Just you know, one last question: does at-large ever consider working outside of ICANN in other aspects of government? Many at-large structures work outside. Obviously, you know, the at-large structures. ISOC New York does all sorts of stuff outside of ICANN. So our at-large structures do that. The at-large itself, being part of ICANN, does not have the ability to do work outside. On the other hand, the regional at-large organizations that have signed a memorandum of understanding, an MOU with ICANN, have the ability to get involved with other endeavors and so on. And for example, in Europe, Euralo, the European at-large organization, has gotten involved with the organization of the European Dialogue on Internet Governance, Eurodig, which is pretty much the European IGF, European Internet Governance Forum. So they've gotten involved with helping out with this. But as far as at-large is concerned, no. The primary function of at-large is to feed the input of Internet end users into ICANN and to also take whatever ICANN is doing and translate it to some language that Internet end users understands. It's really communication in both ways. And that is actually in the ICANN bylaws. So unless we were to decide on changing the ICANN bylaws regarding the mandate of the at-large advisory committee and at-large community, we wouldn't be able to do that. Okay.
Who would you like to see get more involved?
There's space for a lot of different people and a lot of different categories of knowledge. You know, I think privacy advocates is really important, and people who are very clued up on anything to do with, I think Jolie mentioned earlier, who is. You know, the privacy security is important as well. I think that as far as technical things are concerned, we haven't got enough people. There are a lot of people involved in the North American chapter, certainly, North American Regional at-large organization, certainly a lot of people involved in the capacity building side of things, so trying to find tools and ways to share information in a better way, working smarter.
Also, nipping at the heels of ICANN on compliance is one thing
that's an important thing,
that
yeah.
we're known for at Noralo.
I think it's important. I support this. One of the, as I mentioned earlier, one of the big problems is losing your domain name because you forgot to renew it. Or you've moved offices and your email wasn't working for a few days and you never got the renewal notice. And that's it. You know, that's just gone through your net and that's it. You've lost your domain name. The domain name industry in general is very well run and is composed of very good suppliers. But there are some rogue registrars out there that will not play particularly fairly.
One of the biggest successes of at-large was to kill domain tasting, which was
back in the early days. Yeah.
You know, it's about 6-7 years ago now.
That domain tasting was an interesting one. Yeah.
So it was from at-large that the proposal came and killed it. And what this was that they allowed you could get a domain, and if you didn't like it, you could give it back in. And this was used massively by spammers
You could get a domain for free. You didn't have to pay for I don't know how many days or something. So you register a domain, spam everybody, and then drop it. Perfect. I mean, fantastic. Wonderful thing for spammers, but terrible for end users because you'd get all this rubbish through your email. And if you were to complain, the WHOIS records were wrong. It was, sort of Donald Duck was the owner of the domain. And you tried to email back, and of course by then the domain would have disappeared. So effectively, it was a green light for any
it was
any
a good
rubbish.
Example where the pressure came from end users, came up for at-large, went into the policy groups and promoted it, and in the end it was killed. So that, the registries were banned from doing it again.
And what we're trying to push here for at the moment now is a better compliance regime when it comes down to WHOIS records, when it comes down to accountability of the organizations that sell you domain names. Many of the policies which the registries and registrars run are based on ICANN policies. Some are actually nicer than others, but of course it's impossible to know who the nicer in quotes, provider is. So some would basically say, oh, your domain has lapsed 7 days ago. We'll give you a month before you renew it. That's fine. Don't worry. And others on the end of the period, which was right there, will immediately put it into their own backyard and resell it for a huge amount of money. And some would have the majority of their portfolio, the majority of their customers being domainers whose sole business is to buy and sell domain names. And when you speak about domainers, by the way, I used to think, oh, domainers, I've got what? 6-7 domain names, some of which might be, a couple of them are parked, and I could perhaps maybe one day sell them for a couple of $1,000 or something. I don't know. Or, companies that I've had in the past, and I've just thought I'll continue keeping the domain name for it. No, these guys have got 20, 30, 50,000 domain names. They look at it on an Excel spreadsheet. And they look at they all parked and they all bring in advertising, and some of them are like in Google with 1 O instead of 2 O's. This sort of stuff. They work on typo squatting. They work on all these things, and their spreadsheets basically provides them with details of how much each one of their domain names, thanks to the advertising thing, each one of these domain names have brought in. And if they got, if they want to sort of enhance their portfolio, in quotes, they would sell or put on sale all the ones which bring in lower advertising, try and get a premium for them when they sell them, and then buy another bunch that might bring them a higher yield. It's a different world, and the domain speculators, and it's very much real. It's still out there. Fortunately, and I don't know if any domainers are going to watch this, but my personal feeling is, fortunately, the launch of the new generic top-level domains and the 1,000 plus new GTLDs that have been released, whilst having this component part that might bring user confusion, but I think maybe user confusion in a short term because people will start getting used to those. And I know there are a lot of negatives you could say about this new generic top-level domains, but one of the things though is that it will ease the pressure for everyone to have a domain under .com. And so the domainers might find out that what they had purchased for several $1,000s, the price of that might stop rising because there will be other offerings under other top-level domains out there. So people will not be ready to pay $150,000 for a domain name. They'll just get one at $10. That will have a different extension, but it'll be a $10 domain, and they won't have to pay that premium. The only problem at the moment is that search engine optimization still, at the moment, the likes of Google and others, still focus on the original generic top-level domains. So when you look at the ranking of your website, it might rank lower if you have a domain name that's under the new extensions than under the original extensions. But it's probably just a matter of time before the new extensions rise through their search engine optimization systems. So.
Okay, well, I guess our time is up, so I'd like to thank Olivier for giving us the answer out of the day. Also thank Benny for coming down. Yes, which you were here.
And thanks to you, Jolie, for having organized this at such short notice. And thanks to you all. It's always good to see people who are interested in this. And I hope that you'll continue being interested and get involved. I know it's a bit of a sort of nebula seen from outside, but I hope this has given you a little taste of what can be done and the fact that even one person can really make a difference. So, okay. And thanks for those of you who are still out there if you survived. And I don't know if there's any questions from anybody remotely, but no.
No,
probably not.
Our remote participants,
they've all died off.
About an hour in.
Died?
Static laden.
Can I get you some water or coffee or anything? Anyone wants some coffee or water?
I wouldn't mind a glass of water, actually. I'd be quite pleased with that.
Thank you, Olivier. That was very interesting.
I hope you enjoyed.
I did.
See you soon. Bye-bye.